The 5-Minute Photographer with Shelton Muller.
Buying your first SLR camera can be quite exciting, and there are such technological marvels that you can leave the thing set on auto all the time, so you at first think. But can you really? And should you really? There are some scenes that you'll encounter where your camera will just not understand what you're looking for. A scene such as this can throw a camera into a complete spin. There's so much shadow, and then there's highlight. And setting the camera manually and knowing what to do can make all the difference. You may encounter a scene that looks like this, some bright highlight, some dark shadow. Your camera will render it like this, perhaps. Why? Because your camera's meter is designed to see everything as a neutral gray. So when you encounter a scene that looks like this, it will blur, because it's thinking that all the darkness has to be rendered, and the brightness might be blown out a little bit. Your camera's just doing its best, according to what it's been told. Setting the camera manually, and knowing what to meter for, knowing how the shutter speeds and apertures work in your camera can sometimes make all the difference between taking a picture that looks like this, when really the scene that you've encountered is more like this. What it all boils down to is an understanding of shutter speeds and apertures, and being able to set your camera manually so that you can know how to make your pictures work. Let's talk about shutter speeds. Shutter speeds, your shutter is your blind in your camera that opens and closes within a fraction of a second and creates the amount, or allows the amount of time for the exposure. A fast shutter speed, a slow shutter speed. How time is rendered, or how much time you give the light coming through your lens to reach your sensor, is what it's all about. Fast shutter speeds are great for capturing the action, freezing the motion, especially in action and sports photography. A slow shutter speed can also do a very good job, just render it differently. And often slow shutter speeds are very effective in creating the idea of motion and blur. If you put your camera on a tripod and open your shutter for 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 3 seconds, whatever, and allow the motion of a stream or moving objects to render themselves in your image, that can be quite incredible. Watch what happens when you leave your shutter open for 2 hours under a night sky. Apertures. Well, these are known as f-stops, and they are really about the quantity of light that you allow through the lens. It's the opening or aperture in your lens. f/22 is a small aperture. It doesn't let a lot of light in and is perfect, just perfect for a bright day. 1.8 on the other end of the scale, a small number, but a big hole, a wide aperture, and perfect for indoor photography. When you change the aperture in your lens, it also changes how the photo is rendered, from this with a small aperture to this with a wide aperture. A photograph like this one would be taken at f/16, a small aperture. A photograph like this is taken at f/1.8, a wide aperture. An exposure of f8 at 125th of a second is average. But did you know that the same or different combinations will give you exactly the same exposure? Different combinations of shutter speed and aperture will change nothing in terms of exposure, only how your photograph is rendered. And every time you double the amount of light allowed through your aperture by changing it from one number to the number smaller than it, you double the amount of light. Therefore, you have to have the shutter speed time from, say, 1/250th to 1/500th. How a photograph is rendered is dependent entirely often on the combination of shutter speed and aperture that you use. f4 at 125th of a second, for instance, with this particular photograph, is rendered completely different when we change the setting to f/22 at 1/4 of a second. The exposure is exactly the same. The same amount of light is getting through, but the combination of aperture and shutter speed has rendered it completely differently. So hopefully now you'll be able to set your camera on manual, on the M, and take control of your pictures. We hope that you have a better understanding of your camera.